Okay.
I'm just gonna say hi to people. Do now RS5 and make it. Well, Brody, you ready? Huge.
I think they'll give us a secret on that one.
Okay, we'll go ahead. I'm sure a few people will wander in here, but we have a lot to cover, so why don't we get started? We have a few words before we start.
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Drew Bilby, planner, and I will be helping to facilitate the Zoom video portion of the meeting. You'll work alongside the chair to facilitate the meeting proceedings. I have housekeeping items for this hybrid meeting. This meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and cable channel 25. Please remember to mute yourself during the meeting when you are not speaking. The chat function for this public meeting is disabled. All chats will go directly to me. Unless you are participating during the meeting, please turn your video off. This allows active meeting participants to be seen on screen. You will still be able to hear the meeting. When you are participating, please turn your video on. If you have any trouble, you can send a chat to me. The city reserves the right to mute or turn individual videos off to minimize distractions during the meeting. Now I'll send the meeting back over to.
Thank you, Drew. Do we have anyone on Zoom? I can't.
I haven't had anyone come in yet.
Well, okay. Well, we're kind of light here on participation, but I'm sure we'll join in. But I know we've been getting some people joining some of our meetings, so
Yeah.
I'll turn this over to Elizabeth and go from there.
All right. So let's pull up the PowerPoint. And we'll get started. All right, let's do first slide. If you guys don't mind, I'm gonna stand. We've been sitting, talking to people all day. Okay, if I'm out of range of the camera. Can you hear me? Let's give it a sec. Okay, so this evening, this afternoon, we're gonna back up to Plan 2040 a little bit, because of where we left our conversation at our last meeting, and I'll explain that in a minute. We're gonna talk about edits to Module 1 that we made after the June meeting. And we're gonna continue the Module 1 discussion to the extent that we need to, talk about some of the public comment received to date. I moved this up. We're gonna start with an overview of what we've been hearing. And then talk about some of the additional public outreach updates. So the next slide. So what have we been hearing? We started yesterday at about 1:30. We did 3 groups yesterday, 2 groups, and a kind of open drop-in session today. We've had very good participation. At our first meeting, the room was full. So we estimated we had about 35 people show up for that neighborhood focused meeting. The others have been bigger or smaller, no less passionate. And we have a lot of people showing up to share their thoughts for the future of the community with us. So we've heard pretty general support for expansion of ADU allowances. I'm going to stop there and I'm going to say, so we listen to a lot of very passionate people, and we are hearing a piece of what the story is of Lawrence. And so as I share this with you, I want to ask you as our steering committee, what else we need to do to get some of the other voices included in this conversation early, because we don't want them showing up later and saying we hate ADUs and it's 5 minutes before the adoption hearing starts. So I'm going to tell you what we've heard, and then we'll talk again about what else we need to do to garner more input. So expanding ADU allowances. We've had discussion on both sides of an owner occupancy requirement for properties with ADUs. So that doesn't mean the owner has to live in the ADU. It means the owner has to live on site. And so that discussion is balanced between what do we think the neighborhood needs, and that stability of full-time owner occupancy, against, hey, if we do that and we're using ADUs as a housing option, are we providing all our housing options? Because that way only one unit on the site can be rented. So that we've heard support for expanded duplex allowances, but concern about the design of the structure, which follows where our steering committee was last time we talked about this. We've heard support for reduced parking requirements. This is where the public has jumped ahead of us. We have not drafted parking requirements. We have drafted them actually, but nobody's seen them. Except Brody and Gabby and I. But we have been asked to reduce minimum required parking, and had some conversations about how communities get to parking standards and what does it mean, and how does that work. We've heard about a potential need to expand commercial allowances in the R3 residential district. Again, some of this aligns with where steering committee was. We're perhaps not mixing enough for the people we've talked to. So that's sort of, throw it all up. Let's see what comes out of it. Ooh, okay.
It was a funeral for a former city commissioner.
Oh, that's so sweet. Okay, next slide. Wow, that was foot and mouth on my part. I apologize. Okay. We've heard just sort of, we started getting an outline of how we're thinking about sustainability in the community and how that works with this look at more development. And so what we heard as density increases, the value and desire for open space increases, and how does the code reflect this? Some of it was focused on downtown, but we also have started hearing conversation about what does future development look like in Lawrence. So not just thinking about what redevelopment might look like in town or in historic areas, but how are we thinking about new development as it comes in? And that follows our next bullet point. We had a few people bring up a request for more specific development plans for annexation. So not necessarily specific plans on the city's part, but instead of moving the property into urban reserve and waiting to see how it develops, asking for something that is going to be less spread out and more compact and walkable. This piece of discussion came both from a sustainability group and from a housing group. And so the question is, how's the city thinking about future development? Meeting with some representatives from downtown. We had a conversation about how the downtown plan is on point, but how do we encourage, incentivize the redevelopment that would be necessary to get more housing downtown, to get more people living downtown. And then that ties back into a parking discussion about a minute and a half later. We heard about how some of the I think it's not necessarily height restrictions, it's the historic and cultural resources environs regulations limit some of the development or redevelopment height downtown. And it's possible that in some areas that development just doesn't pencil out. So developers aren't doing it because they need a bigger envelope to make something work. We heard about other people's fear of change. There are people in the community who have fear of change. It came up once or twice. I'm laughing at it. It's not funny. Fear of change is what it sends people in to tell us that the changes to the code aren't going to work. So for us, that is something to circle in on and talk about what are the dimensions of that and what do we need to understand about that. And then pretty pragmatic comment about the need for more food sources. And so I think this is food sources in terms of food shopping. And the farmer's market, not necessarily like being able to grow food, could be, and development along the river. So that's a smattering of what we've heard. We'll write up notes and share them with everybody. But we have had really thoughtful conversations and participants. We have taken a few of these off the draft that's on the website, and we are getting very detailed comments on the draft. And so it's not just us getting them, the draft has open comments on it. So if you haven't gone to look through it yet, you can see how people are commenting. So before I move on, I'll ask if anyone wants any more specificity about these, or if you just want to let them kind of wash over you.
You might go back to page 1 real quick.
Yep.
We had 3 or 4 people walk in,
Thank you.
some of which have strong opinions, I think, about the first couple of ones. You might
Good.
say
Okay,
those again real quick.
let's start back at the top. So what we've heard from our meetings over the last couple days. So predominantly, and some of it echoes what we're seeing in the comments in the draft. So we've heard pretty unanimous support for expanding ADUs into most residential neighborhoods. Any place where you could have single unit, 2 unit townhomes, expanding ADUs there. we had a discussion, we've heard both sides of the discussion about owner occupancy requirements for properties that have ADUs. So does the owner have to live in one of the units? Can both units be rented? How does that work? And in this conversation, I'll just add on from the first round. Sometimes what jams up ADU regulations is that fear of change that we had on the last slide. And it helps to take it in baby steps. So it helps to do the regulations you can get in place to start with and let them ride for a year or two, and then expand them out, let them ride for a year or two, and then start pulling out stuff that got in the way. And we've seen that in other communities. So by about year 3 or 4, they can say, hey, this particular requirement that all entrances not be facing the front isn't really getting us anywhere. So we can maybe let that go. So that's something we can talk about. Okay, so we heard support for expanded duplex allowances, but like we talked about, definite concerns about the design of the structure. What we didn't bring up with the general public was based on your instructions. We're working on a photograph book or a pattern book of the different types of development that we'll be able to share out and let people know that we can tailor some of the design standards within the updated code in the second module. Let's see, we heard support for reducing parking requirements, and we have not shared any parking requirements with anybody.
Except for the ADUs, where there is a specific thing for ADUs on parking requirements.
Okay, except on ADUs.
Yeah.
But in general, we heard reduce, consider eliminating, consider letting the market decide what it's going to be. We play devil's advocate with that on occasion, and talked about what is our biggest challenge in code writing with reducing parking requirements, and that's typically multi-unit development apartments. We realize that almost all apartment residents have at least one car. If you're doing multiple roommates, you've got more cars than that. Lots of bikes, bike storage problems. And so, but we'll talk about this in module 2. We brought it up because we wanted to let you know that this was one of its own like self-leading ideas that we hadn't flagged for anybody, but it's definitely out there. Nick, are you behind that? Huh? Are you
sorry.
reading this into the community right now?
No, I'm actually surprised to see it, frankly. And same for the first one, support for expanded ADU allowances. Based on my limited understanding of the history of ADUs in Lawrence, that's a change for what I would consider the better, but that's just my view.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I said early on was we've had some pretty passionate people and some people that have kind of dug in and brought us some of their thoughts about what we need to do within the code. And so it is an excellent conversation, but it is likely missing part of the community. And the part of the community that we want to hear from early on. So one of the questions that we're going to put back to the group is, do we want to send out postcards? Do we want to send out flyers? Do we want to tell people we're taking away all parking requirements and they will show up for a meeting once we say that? Yes.
Yeah, that was actually exactly the segue I was hoping to hear eventually, which is you've been through the story many times before. We have not. So at this point, we're seeing just limited sampling of who's showing up. It's probably people who are interested in kind of the wonky policy aspects of it or are really urbanist, proud. But there's probably a lot of people who just are going about their lives, don't really care. And then once it hits them, like you're saying, once a development comes up that there's like, well, the zoning code says we don't need parking. We're not going to do parking. Then the pitchforks come out. And how often do you see that the best of intentions are followed early on in the process, but the people who oppose stuff don't show up until way, way later? Is that pretty normal?
It is typical, and it's not a pattern that we want to work with.
Yeah.
And so in the same way we've been flagging for you guys, hey, we're allowing duplexes everywhere in this code. And we're, allowing ADUs everywhere. We've been telling every group we talk to that those changes are in there with the hope that it will filter out into the community. But because we want to draw that conversation early to find our points of agreement and our points of contention, we're probably going to do some more emailings and probably postcards and do something to let people know this is going on. So we won't find agreement on a lot of things, but we can find good conversation on a lot of things. And that's where we're going to go. Did you want to say something?
Well, I just wanted to add, when you talk about expanded duplex allowances, that there was a comment that duplexes designed for students may be different than duplexes designed for families. So do we want to recognize that that's a very different kind of development if you're trying to put in 4 bedrooms for 4 students versus a family? I don't know that you mentioned the issue of covenants and,
We're getting,
okay,
yeah, glad you said that. And
so I'll let you get there.
thank you.
The other one, and a comment that you made during your presentation that I thought was particularly important, was when you talked about commercial, adding commercial, which I think everyone is interested in. You talked about the hours that commercial would be open, because it's very different to have a neighborhood barbershop that closes at 7 at night than it is to have a bar that closes at 2 p.m. So how do we recognize that commercial can be very different in terms of those hours? So
And I think that you're a step forward in a good way, because that's part of like tailoring the right thing to the right location. We didn't get that far in the conversations today, but as we're talking, that's probably a place we're going to need to go. We actually had that particular conversation about downtown because we were asking our downtown group, hey, what if we lift the 45% other merchandise or whatever restriction and open up to more alcohol uses in more places? And there are downtown business owners who are concerned that that would be bad for downtown. It would switch more of those businesses into bars and remove some of the retail balance that's going on there. So that's kind of how we've been going with that. So on the covenant thing, it didn't make it onto our list, but I will explain. As we've been having this conversation about allowing more types of housing in more locations, there's a sort of a recognition and a concern that there are neighborhoods in the city that have deed restrictions and covenants on them in which those unit types won't be allowed. So even if Lawrence's code says you can have ADUs or you can have duplexes, if the subdivision has covenants on it, or if it's a planned development with covenants that say, no, you can't, that overrides. And so the concern is that there are a number of neighborhoods where those changes wouldn't be made. Would that force change back into older neighborhoods or historic neighborhoods or uncovenanted neighborhoods? How would that, where would the water flow? And what does that mean in terms of implementing the plan? Because, part of the plan is dispersing and making different housing types available in a lot of different locations. So are we inadvertently putting pressure on the system by allowing this? So Becky shared with me a memo that staff has put together on covenants. I haven't had a chance to look through it yet, but I think that's going to need to be a part of our conversation. The other piece of our conversation that started coming up and is timely is, hey, what incentives are we going to offer to get to X development or Y development? And how are those incentives meaningful? So we may want something to happen, but we might not want to regulate to that end. Let's take something that came up, solar panels, right? It could be a little challenging. We could get pushback if we say everyone's going to have solar panels, all new development, Tesla roof, people to do it, right? And we're going to hear, that is a significant add to the cost of development, that, storage for solar panels is going to be super expensive right now. The technology is changing all the time. But we might want to incentivize it. We certainly want to make it easier to do it if people want to do it. So we have some categories that will come across as we're drafting of make it easy to do, make it interesting to do, or make it required to do. Where do we want to land on some of these things? So that's been part of our conversation, which is pretty good timing to start thinking about that as we start doing this. If questions about these, yeah.
As we get into the covenant issue, it might be helpful if staff had the ability to kind of identify neighborhoods or plan developments that actually have those in place. Because I know for me, it would help evaluate what's going to happen around that area. Because what you said, basically, people with restricted covenants through a homeowners association or something, we're going to see their areas become even more exclusive and watch
Yeah.
increased development in other places. So
We do see that ADUs on the whole raise property values. So that's a net positive. I would ask, before promising anything, I'm going to look at Jeff and Becky. Is that possible? That may not be information that this keeps.
it's not.
It's not.
Not information the city keeps. We tried to undertake that about year, maybe a year and a half ago. And we realized it would probably take a team the better part of a year to go through and pull them all. So we didn't continue. We just didn't have the resources.
And we asked about that.
Well, and the
So
kind
to
of
put-
covenants would be vastly different.
So to put Becky on the spot, there is some sort of staff memo regarding covenants.
Yes, it was a memo that was provided to the city commission. We can forward that out to you.
It's about legal.
And essentially what it's going to say is that
Can't do. and-
it's going to say that that city doesn't enforce covenants. A covenant just gives a right of action to someone else that's in that covenant area. And that's what makes covenants interesting, is they're not bulletproof. They just give somebody that doesn't like what you're doing, it gives them a right of action to go to the courthouse. But I mean, this country has a long history of covenants. You know, some covenants say that, you can't have a chain link fence, and other covenants say someone of some certain race or ethnicity can't live next door to you. And so covenants aren't bulletproof. They can be pushed through. And I would also, just for laughs, point out that, times have changed and these covenants were made in a day before we found ourselves, with a housing shortage in Lawrence. And if somebody in an area that has a restrictive covenants against an ADU decided to go ahead and punch it and come down and get a permit from Jeff and say, I'm going to do it. And then a neighbor said, no, you're not, and filed suit. I believe the city could weigh in as a third party intervener and say, times have changed. And we believe that this covenant, we believe it's not for the good of the community. We believe that it should not be enforceable, and the city could put skin in the game. They could actually weigh into that litigation and start to try to turn the tide, because otherwise this holistic project of ours to try to make, density available across the city, it really is going to keep flowing back into older neighborhoods because, we have these things that may or may not be enforceable on, these covenants.
I don't know that that's necessarily true, that it's going to flow into older neighborhoods, because there are a lot of older neighborhoods in Lawrence that have covenants.
Right.
And they're they're not all covenants the same. The covenants you see out on the west side of town in newer developments aren't necessarily the same kind of restrictions you see in neighborhoods around the university or some of the older neighborhoods in town. But I think there are a lot more covenants in Lawrence than we realize. And it's not all just newer development.
And the thing is those covenants, you could look around, because remember, you can't enforce covenants piecemeal. They have to be enforced universally. So if somebody, imagine their neighbor wants to build an ADU, and that somebody decides I'm going to sue them. But that same property owner has a neighbor that's across the street or one house down that's had essentially an ADU sitting there for 10 years right there. That would be
That's
a
not
bar.
necessarily true anymore either, because common ownership interest bill of rights gives HOAs a lot of
But remember,
discretion what to enforce and what not
We have
to.
a lot of, we can, yeah, there's a lot to fight there.
Lawyers are getting off track.
Yeah, I could say a lot too, but I'll also say, like you said, the other hard part when we looked at this, some say you can't have an ADU, some say you can't rent, some say you can't have an outbuilding. Some say you can't have and so again, what someone used in a particular case to try to stop something, and some might allow it if it's attached, some might not allow it. I mean, there's all sorts of variables that I think would be on a case by case basis, but we've tried and it'd be very difficult, but it's something to certainly consider.
Thank you.
But
Thank you. Yeah, no, that
so
would.
I guess I'd say on the big picture, I mean, I would agree with what you were saying. I mean, most of the people who talk to me about the development code want these sorts of changes. They want density, they're concerned about the environment, they're concerned about affordable housing. Those are the ones paying attention. The other group of people say, I don't care much about the code until it affects me. And so those are the ones we have to try to get out in front of and see. You know, they're not thinking about it yet, but what do they think about an ADU next to them? What do they think about the good for the community? I think more than, I mean, what I hear, more people than 5 years ago like the idea of ADUs that didn't like them 5 years ago. People who didn't like density 5, 10 years ago like density now, not universally, but there's definitely a shift. I don't know how far that shift has come and how wide that is, but that's what we have to try to continue to gauge as we move through this process.
We have some questions over here.
And the biggest concern or fear I have heard thus far on those that are afraid of density or change is property values. And I feel like there's an absolute wealth of knowledge that maybe we could hit that off with some education, because in general, 30 years of studies have said affordable housing in particular, or higher density, or what we associate ADUs do not reduce property values. Very seldomly do, and especially in our market. So that might be a good piece of education with this.
I agree. I'm thinking about another community that we were talking to in Colorado, Broomfield, if you're familiar. They've been working on a housing facts information campaign along those lines. They started out calling it housing myths, and they realized they were on the wrong path. So they switched back to facts. So we can figure out, 3 or 4 important things we want to say and do an educational thing. Okay. All right. So we're in, so I feel like we're sort of in agreement. Like, we think we're hearing the people who are really on top of this, because there are changes they want to see. Probably others in the community who aren't with us yet. They may not be with us until later. And our kind of, story to ourselves is some of them won't be with us until it's fully drafted and they realize that we're actually serious about doing this, which is why we left a little time at the end.
Just to add that the time of your meetings impacts who can show up and have comment too.
Yeah.
Because
people are people. They're going to do their thing. Okay, so let's go talk about a few other things here. So go down one slide, next slide. Okay, so last time we were here, as a group, you gave us really good guidance about taking the draft that we've done for module 1 and going further with it. So we made some of those changes within kind of the week and a half between that meeting and when we posted. We still have a few smaller changes to make within there and to make it all make sense. But we wanted to back up to Plan 2040 and see if there's anything in terms of implementing the plan that makes you think there are additional changes to this module that make it more fully implement the plan. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so everyone probably has seen the tier map. And so tier 1 in blue, or if you are blue-green colorblind, it's in the middle here, where it says tier 1, that's the giveaway. So this is within Lawrence, and our instruction from the plan, our goal is to maximize development opportunities within tier 1 before expanding to tier 2. So tier 2 in the green around the edges, that's Lawrence's growth area. And then tier 3 in the beige is future growth area. So I believe tiers 2 and 3 are both still in Douglas County, correct? Only within the teal color here. That looks like Carolina blue. Who did this? I'm just saying.
Jeff.
Okay.
Jeff was in charge.
Yeah, so this is where we're focusing ourselves. The plan tells us to focus ourselves there. So let's go to the next slide. So the plan gives us these 5 ranges of residential density. So this is some of what we were talking about as we were looking through the draft. And it says encourage integration of higher density residential development through compatible design. So we've got three things going on. If we take this sentence apart and diagram it, it's encourage integration, higher density residential development, compatible design. And at this range of densities. So I believe the rural density is out in the county. I think very low might be out in the county, and I can't remember off the top of my head.
It would correspond to RS40 in the city.
Okay, so that's which will be R1 now, okay. And so then we get the low, medium, high, and very high. So based on Marcy's instruction, we made the correction, so it's clear where your cutoff is in there, thank you. But so the rest of our question here is, these are pretty broad ranges. And we've set up the zone districts to kind of capture those pretty broad ranges. When we think about making change along these lines, if we have broad density ranges and we have compatible design standards, do we think that we can bring the communities, the neighborhoods who might be living with change to a comfortable place? And so one of the things that we did last time was we talked about creating some opportunities for small lot development and limiting some sorts of residential units to 3 as a max, because that might be the most that we want to see on a lot for infill in some areas. And I know I'm asking kind of a pretty wide open question, but I'm wondering, if people signed off on this in the plan, are they going to remember that when we come back to them with the zone districts and say, yeah, we said we were doing this. This is what it looks like in the zone districts. Do you think that some of our bigger conversation around this needs to actually hit all 3 of the plan goal ideas? So integration, higher density, and compatible design. Should we go easy on this conversation until we also have the design standards in, which is some of the fear we were hearing from people? So what concerned you guys when you read through the districts and uses? What do you think might concern neighborhoods, neighbors, people who are have not voluntarily immersed themselves in this discussion?
I think I may have brought this up in the last meeting, and I know we definitely hammered it quite a bit more than it needed to be, but the pictures that are shown tend to show things that are on large lots rather than individual small lots. And I think lot consolidation is problematic for a lot of people, whether it be the size and the scale of a thing, even if it's the same density as a smaller lot, or even just something more abstract like the concentration of wealth, right? Like if one person owns all this crap versus like 10 different people owning stuff in a row, I think that's maybe a little bit more palatable to folks. So that's why I think one of my suggestions was it's still good to show a big building because that's what most of them do look like. But it'd be nice to maybe show, like, if we weren't doing greenfield, what would it look like? We would probably have these small lots with maybe like, smaller 4-story apartment buildings on a 50-foot wide lot.
Okay, so, and maybe I'm interpreting this, but I'm hearing you say it's good to actually look at what the structures might look like, where we'll go with the photographs instead of the graphics.
I think the graphics are still good because they're kind of conceptual and they don't, super tie into any particular building. Like, oh, I don't want that exact thing in my community. But I think showing the different ends of it in terms of like, these are both the same density, but they are in different lot sizes and they might not be in the exact same neighborhoods.
So helping people envision. Do you think plan view of a subdivision layout helps anybody, or is that not easy to understand without actually the proportion of the unit on it?
I don't think it would hurt. I mean, a lot of people are familiar with maps, so it should be okay.
People in my world are, I don't know about the rest of the world. Yeah.
Sure.
So Google Maps sent me to a vacated section of Missouri Street today. Why? This is a Google Map problem. It's not a Lawrence problem, but I wasn't like being sent into like the Mojave Desert. No, it's just a vacated road. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the thing that I think Nick commented on that's interesting is, right now Lawrence has a significant proportion of rental property and rental ownership. So how do we make sure that there's also the opportunity for homeownership, be it townhouses, be it condos, because I think, you know, as we learn, you know, people's opportunity for investment, and to help that is often through their home. And so the more we go towards developments that don't allow for that individual ownership, the less opportunity there is for families to create their own
For a lot of
equity.
people to get into that equity
Yeah.
game, into that place on the property ladder. It's so, to me, it's interesting. You are the third person today who has said that your home is your biggest investment. And I wonder how that's resonating to people who are thinking about this code and what it could do. So that kind of ties back to where we were about how this isn't decreasing your property value, but also kind of thinking about who we are. I'm getting super philosophical.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that since Plan 2040 has come around, that I've had very few people argue that they don't like putting aside the new land in infill. That they, you know, that they don't support the ideas of Plan 2040.
Okay.
When it comes to a project in their neighborhood, you know, they might object. Or if you ask them the question, do you support density, increased density? Yes. Do you support density on your block? Not so much. I mean, that's where I think, so I'm not sure we can, I don't know how to drive that conversation.
So that's the next set of mapping that we're going to get to. And we haven't put up the conversion maps yet because I still need to edit the text a little bit. But the second round of mapping that we're doing is the density of Lawrence's neighborhoods. So when we say it can be 16 to 32, you can go look and have a personal reference, like, oh, I'm familiar with this neighborhood and that's what the density is.
That'll be helpful.
Yeah, we're trying to make that less abstract, more concrete. Okay, so we're staying on path with this one, knowing where we're going. Let's do next slide. Okay, so we'll move into commercial. We have spent a lot of time on residential. Let's talk commercial for a minute. And so the goal from Plan 2040 is encourage the retention and redevelopment of the community's established commercial areas. And so you can see we took these commercial types out of the plan, and they're reflected in the 3 layers of mixed zoning. And then downtown has kept its own status. But so that's kind of where we've been going with these roll-ups. And we're not hearing a lot about commercial. Do you think that could be because commercial's working pretty well in Lawrence? Do we want to see redevelopment of anything that we're not seeing redevelopment of? Does that fall into our, incentives category? How do we jumpstart some of this? Or really is focusing on residential and thinking about the housing market as is one of our more important tasks right now on this code change? Yeah.
I mean, I would say they're both pretty important, especially because of all these mixed use districts. They're going to be pretty equal at some point. This is my theory, so feel free to push back on this. This is way off, but the vast majority of people alive today who are active in politics or civic anything have only ever known 2 different types of commercial development: big box stores in the burbs where you got to drive to, and quaint, historical, beautiful, fun downtowns. And pretty much every Midwestern town or city of any size has a downtown of some sort. In some places they look kind of rough. In some places they're a lot of fun, like Lawrence. But that's kind of the only 2 commercial things that most people have ever seen in this country. You'd have to go back to like the greatest generation to know people who actually knew when there were 7 grocery stores in East Lawrence. It's just not in living memory anymore. So I think people may just not be able to grasp what this could look like. It's pretty foreign, especially if you haven't been outside the area very much. So I almost wonder if the sheer lack of knowledge is contributing to the lack of input as well.
It lines up with what our chairman was saying earlier. It's fine in theory, but until you want to put one in my neighborhood.
Yeah,
What happened to the 7 grocery store buildings?
they're all just single family homes or duplexes now. Like you can tell which ones are which because they have an odd corner entrance, but they're all over the place.
That made me feel really old. I remember.
Didn't mean to refer to you as the greatest generation. I was a lot further back, frankly.
I think it's more than just that the people don't remember. I think there's a reason why it evolved the way it did. And an example, we have a commercial building in Old East Florence that would be an ideal place for a small grocery store. I can't find anyone who would even give consideration to doing that. People in the business say there's no possible way you can make that a viable store. I've been to other communities where I've seen that a same size footprint of grocery store working all over Denver, small little neighborhoods where that exists. But something about the makeup of where we are, just that on its own in an island, people in.
It has to do with walkability, because I've lived in downtown Chicago, and essentially everywhere in LA is downtown. But those communities are walkable. In fact, there's an incentive not to get in your car. It's like, hey, I had to work for a half hour just to find the illegal parking spot that I have. So, you're on foot. And so where there's a disincentive to get in that car, then suddenly you're willing to walk all over the place. But where it's just so easy to go to a big box grocery store, there's plentiful parking and it's free parking. It's just, there are places where you can't even park at the grocery store unless, without paying. So that's not things that are part of our reality here. So I think there's lots of people, to Nick's point, that in Lawrence that have traveled around. You've traveled extensively, lived extensively, but then there's people that haven't. So I think that there's people here that could say it actually works. It's really cool, but there are it's just baked into the system. Just using the car is just what we do in the Midwest, unfortunately.
To the point about needing some incentive to make mixed use environments work, that might be the thing. It takes a critical mass. It takes more than just this thing for it to happen. Combination of things.
Probably need a lot more density like we had back in the day.
Also, you have something?
Well, I was just going to add that it's both walkability and density, sort of. So you have to have them both. And until we can increase the density, then those little grocery stores aren't going to make it. Because I was involved with trying to, save the one in East Lawrence, and we shopped it. I'm trying to remember who was on 23rd Street, and they gave us a deal, but there's no way that a grocery store can make it with the amount of sales unless there's that density around them to be able to walk to. So.
Chicken and egg right now.
But I'd also add on the bigger, not just the neighborhood scale, when we created the mixed use district, it's even before Jeff was here, we did these charrettes about, hey, this is what 15th and Haskell's going to look like. This is what the malls is going to look like. And we have these drawings of mixed use and residential and all this. We're going to redo the malls. And of course, none of it ever happened. But I do think the smart code, smart code, mixed use code, I still think with the demand for housing now, I think we have, and a right code that allows some of that. I think you have a much better chance, for example, with someone to say, I'm ready to do something with the malls, the whole area. I'm ready to do something with 19th and Haskell, So I whether or not it happens, if we have to incentivize it, I don't know, but it's still a goal of allowing that mixed use in all our commercial districts.
And that's where I believe that the annexation should go straight to mixed use. So instead of urban reserve, because if you say that this new property is going to be mixed use, and then if you want something different, you have to petition to.
Yeah, so that is like zoning grad school level, so like 706 zoning, something like that. So my first question I'm going to ask Becky and Jeff totally unfairly. We do urban reserve because that allows the maximum amount of time before someone has to start paying to put facilities at the lowest level. Would there be an expense to doing something like saying, hey, you know, you need to come in as a mixed use district and that's what you need to provide services for?
I don't know if there's a direct expense. The only reason urban reserve exists is because in Article 1, it says upon annexation, either the applicant or the city commission shall move you to a zoning district, and the applicant can choose to go directly to a district. And if they don't, the city commission shall initiate amendment and move you to UR. I don't think that necessarily has an implication because most of the time, if you get put into a district, you're not doing any development. You're just sitting ready. I can think of different bits of Lawrence over the years that probably sat as a R2 or a commercial district. I can't think of off the top of my head. And it's just been sitting in that capacity for years. Improvements and all that would come with development, not necessarily with zoning. The thing I don't know is if the appraiser's office would tax differently based on it. But I don't think they would because there is no
Based on use.
Based on use, as
Yeah.
long as you're farming it.
Yeah, as long as you're blank land, they're just going to react in that way. So I can't think of anything else that would necessarily run into that. We've got instances all over town of both things being in UR for a long time or being in commercial and residential for a long time. So it's really a little bit of applicant's decision or code compelling the UR being applied.
And just for the rest of the story, I think if I understand it correctly, the city's kind of at an agreement place with the county about what stays in the county, what comes into the city. And that goes, go back to the tier map. So I guess my other question, just a practical question, is if we have someone come in and the way we've done this is say, you know, it's kind of a you pick three zoning districts. Only one of them can be single family residential. Everything else has to be something else, and tell us what it's going to be over time. Do we have, or what would it cost? Just ballpark to get the infrastructure for something like that out to the growth area? Is there a benefit in terms of where Plan 2040 is and doing that?
We know in some areas, the cost, we worked with MSA to get to those areas, but the tier 2 area was based upon a number of things. The short version of a long answer is it was based on where fire could reach, where the utilities were readily available, and what was within the land radius for travel times of the street network that we had at that point. So that was kind of where we thought the reach was, given our conversation with utilities and public works at the time.
I might be open to exploring the conversation that we take a more mixed use approach to annexations that come in from tier 2. Would that be something I'm not asking, you can sit and smile at me like, yeah, that's the consultant, whatever she's talking about over there. Is that a conversation the group would like to have? Is this important in the scheme of things?
Is that going to be part of module 3 processes and stuff, or does it come in early? Okay.
It would have a process component to it, but we would want to start looking at our zone district lineup to kind of see what would be appropriate in those areas based on what else is going on out there.
I guess this may not be the appropriate time, so stop me if this is like way not not timed well, but for a while, there's been this whole thing of the community benefit needs to be demonstrated before you can annex into the community. And that was, I don't know, I forget if that was intentionally left kind of vague because it was going to be hammered out later or not, but I think there's been a lot of discussion on what is a community benefit. And because it's so subjective and qualitative, it's kind of hard to say with any authority what is and what isn't, right? Because depending on your perspective, one of the things that I've been tossing around is based on, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Strong Towns, Urban 3, the kind of places that really try to do the math on what it costs to serve an area and what that area brings in taxes. Generally speaking, newer suburban areas that are kind of less dense don't really pay for themselves in terms of property tax that they bring in versus the amount it takes to build, maintain, and replace their infrastructure. So because of that, they end up being kind of a financial drain on the city. And there's been a lot of these visual maps kind of showing what different cities look like, and it's always the exact same. It's like downtown, historic, poor older neighborhoods are always generally revenue generating. And further out neighborhoods that are perceived as pretty wealthy turned out to actually be a drag on the community based on how much they require in services and how little they bring in. So what I would propose, just throwing it out there, is do the math on any new annexation. Would the proposed level of intensity of development and types of uses bring in the amount of property tax that would be required to maintain it over at least one life cycle of infrastructure? I believe that we have enough information from MSO that we could actually calculate that. There's been a lot of building all over the city. Certainly we have some kind of numbers for lane miles, road, linear feet of pipe, fire hydrants, et cetera. And then you could probably pretty easily talk to the appraiser's office and get calculations of what it would cost or what they would raise in property taxes based on comps. So I feel like it can be done. We have the information. We have GIS specialists. That would at least be a quantitative way that you can then argue on actual data and, and assumptions instead of saying like, well, I believe that more housing in general is beneficial use. Like, well, who are you, right? So that's my kind of engineering approach.
Danny and I are trying to think about what to say here. I mean, there's been a lot of that. I mean, we've had discussions of spending money to figure those out. Again, the answers are all math dependent. I mean, you make that calculation on a $400,000 house with this much linear foot, and then it sells for 500,000. It just changed.
Mhm.
Did it pay for itself yesterday? Did it pay for itself today? If it drops to 300,000, you add that ADU. So it's not as useful in long-term planning
Mhm.
because it has so many variables related to that. But so what we ended up saying is we all agree that the denser it is, the more taxes you'll pay, and that's a good thing. Therefore, Plan 2040 says that. And so, I mean, I do think that is kind of baked into Plan 2040, that idea is there.
But there's no backstop to tell whether it's going to be a net drain or a benefit to the economy, right? I mean, there's no quantitative like, oh yeah, we can tell.
That's what I said,
Yeah.
we talked about doing $100,000, paying somebody $100,000 to do that study.
Yeah.
And they said, we can do that and you'll be out of date by the time we finish that study. And then you can pay us $50,000 a year to update it every year. And we decided we didn't want to do that. But I hear what you're saying. It's a long discussion, but I don't know that drives it. Second thing is lots of debate about if you're only looking at property taxes and how do you factor in sales tax?
Mhm.
How do you factor in what the person is, that person buys a car in Lawrence, they just paid for their street for a longer period of time than the person who bought the car in Olathe versus the person who didn't buy the car. How do you quantify that person's buying habits? And so there's a lot of
Mhm.
factors that go into that. So I hear what you're saying. I like strong towns. I understand the concept, but we've had that discussion and so far we've never gone that route. I'm not sure we do it here.
Is the other question one that you could say, oh, this is going to pay for itself because we're including a certain amount of commercial? But there's only so many dollars that are being spent by the people in Lawrence. So adding commercial one place may take away dollars from another place. So, and that's why industrial and business is so important because you have an industry and if they're selling outside the community, that really is money coming in. But if you're adding commercial, there's only so many lattes we're going to buy or
No, there's
Cars
no limit on that.
But back to your question.
The point is important. Yeah.
I guess I'm back to your original question. The suggestion that when annexed automatically comes in as some zoning
It
district.
comes in as urban reserve.
I know that now, but
Yeah, so the questions that have been brought up is, should it come in as mixed development of some sort? And I think what we're sorting out is, and I'm gonna look at you because you carried the water on this one. What are we looking for by doing that?
Yeah.
We're looking at density.
But are you saying that someone can't ask for something else? Or if they don't ask, it has to be instead of urban reserve, if they don't ask for anything, it just has to be mixed use?
Mixed use, they come in as mixed use. If they want something different, then they have to go argue that it is beneficial. Because we're trying to get bigger density.
Well, under the, I mean, I guess what I'm thinking more procedurally, under the current code, if someone wants to annex and ask for commercial, they can. If they want to annex and ask for, it's two agenda items. I want to annex,
Goes into
and then I go,
urban reserve, right?
if they don't ask. My question is, are you saying you don't want them to be able to ask for anything else? Or if they don't ask for anything, they have to be,
They just, if they don't ask, it goes into mixed.
okay, that's,
Let's say M1, if the default would be M1 unless they ask for something else.
I would
So-
say there that one of the things is that if you say it's going to be M1, you're giving the signal and making the expectation of density.
That's what we want.
Okay,
So-
you're sending a signal to the development community that this is what we want.
So
in my
are we,
opinion.
are we talking about creating sort of a presumption then that in one or mixed use is in and of itself a community benefit? And if you want something different than that, you have to argue for what your
That's
community
what I
benefit
would like
is?
to see.
I think so.
So if we look at the map, do we want density at the edges or do we want density in pockets? I mean, certainly downtown, it's great because it's dense. We want some density and we have some density near the university. How do we create pockets rather than a circle of density?
I think that's a fair question. I just to be devil's advocate, and I'm not gonna ask you this one because it's not fair. You're bringing the question forward, but is mixed use what everyone in the community would want to see? And maybe that's incorrect. We're not going to get to everyone, but are there places where there are still going to be people who prefer to live on that larger lot development? And that's where some that new development should go. Purposefully not making this your question, but you can answer it.
The way I'm looking at it is we cannot do infill and create the housing that we need. It's not happening here. It can't. So annexation has to happen. If we don't include that as a goal, as mixed use and more dense, it won't be.
Okay, so why are you saying it can't happen if you go along Kentucky Street?
I'm not saying that.
No, but I'm just saying, we're seeing replacement of current development with some really nice looking.
And how many building permits were pulled last year?
79. something like that.
Yeah.
Small, but that's still a true statement, Dawn, that there is some of that. And how do you factor in ADUs by right? Doesn't that allow for density?
The demand right now is far greater than what would be for an ADU.
Understood.
So is there a different conversation? Can we go through to the residential one that had the density? Yeah. I think that the things I want to ask of you all as a group is, do we think the city can support that much more commercial? I think that would be one of the questions. And I think that we definitely don't want to sort of cannibalize the existing commercial with new spaces that would come in cheaper. Is it, instead of a mixed use question, is it a medium density question? So you don't necessarily have to put the commercial out there, but you can't do residential large lot. What do you think, Jeff?
One of the things I didn't mention earlier is all that area in tier 2 was already given future land use under one of the area or sector plans. So it has designations for density and expectations to it. Now, those are all tied to old code or old things there. But there are areas that would be maybe put in as low or put in as industrial or put in as high, depending upon the different sector plans. So there is a little bit of those things that may enter into that discussion. I didn't want to let it go too far without interjecting that bit of knowledge for the group's consideration.
And what my vision would be was that we're not looking at creating a second downtown in an annexed area or a large commercial area. I'm thinking more the smaller,
The neighborhood.
like a law firm or something like that, you know, some commercial, the barbershops or, you know, whatever, grocery stores, small grocery stores, if you can find them.
Most of what I've heard over the years about commercial is why do we need more when we have so many empty commercial properties now? Or I wish I had this one particular store here. So let's build something new so we can possibly get that one particular store. Or the third is it's a grocery store. Those are the ones that come up the most about commercial for the most part. Because you'll hear comments, what about 31st and Iowa? We got giant empty restaurants there. But part of that's tied to the restrictions because it's on Home Depot property that nobody can do anything that competes with sales of Home Depot there.
Everything under the sun these days.
Yes, which is why they sit empty, other restaurants that can't make it. But and Menards still has outlots they haven't sold for commercial. And yet we talk about expanding more commercial areas, but in the common perception of people that don't follow everything, it's like there are empty buildings everywhere that aren't being used for commercial. So why do we need more?
Let's take two last comments. I don't think we're gonna resolve this. I think everyone sees the contours of this conversation. So we take two last comments and I shelve this one and bring it back at our next meeting. Okay.
To the question you asked a while ago, is there, I'll say it a little bit differently, is there market for a need for something other than mixed use? Is there a market appetite and need for neighborhood with larger lots? I think, yes, there is. And I would hope that as we go about this, that we don't try to get at one by just outlawing the other, that there's a way to get at both without the bar being so high that we can't address that market.
That's usually, not everybody likes to live the same way. So it's something that we try to keep in mind.
All right.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, because now I have two comments. So the issue with the commercial emptiness, I know what you mean, and I feel like the optics are bad, right? Like there's a lot of empty stores, empty storefronts, empty big box. I feel like it's sort of an issue of poorly allocated supply and poor spatial distribution of stuff, right? Like all the really cool walkable stuff is all on one street in downtown, far across the city from everybody else. So stuff that could be walkable and of interest to folks in Wakarusa and 6th Street isn't really allowed to be built there because the CD district is pretty restrictive and both spatially and, so that it's like, yeah, there are probably some empty spaces downtown because we're expecting everybody to go to the same place for this kind of commercial thing instead of splitting it up like other cities do, right? And then with the case of big box stores, that's a very specific kind of retail. And we are very likely overdone in that, but that's not to say that we're over retail or over commercialized with other smaller scale things that might be more amenable to small businesses instead of having to rely on a national chain, right? I think in the case of, it's almost like if you look at the car market right now, there's no such thing as a new car like under 30,000 anymore. It doesn't really exist. There's a ton of demand for it, but they can't really be built based on how the regulations kind of steer people towards larger cars like trucks and SUVs. So at this point, the regulations have steered us towards small downtown commercial and huge big box, not really serving the entire market. So I think it's kind of unfair to say that, commercial is never going to work. It's over commercialized. Well, not the way we've currently done it, but if we were to ease up on regulations and allow what the market may actually demand, then we might see a very different landscape, I think.
Okay, that's our last word.
I want to jump
Okay.
way back. I just want to jump way back to about community benefit.
Yeah.
It was left squishy with the intent that it will be solidified in this process. We were all very naive to think we would have gotten to this process sooner than we did, instead of just starting it 3 years after it was put in place, which is why it's causing everybody conniptions. Because it was left that way, because that was the biggest bone of contention in the entire plan about what that might mean. And I have to say, I'm one of the ones that was a little bit naive. I thought we would have been here sooner. So now we're fighting about, is our houses by themselves a community benefit, which suck.
Yeah, I think it's a more nuanced question, even our houses by themselves in this market. A community benefit, 15 years ago, we were all said, it's just something that happened, it's not a community benefit, but now that we've gone this long in a, a definitely underbuilt housing market, it feels like it is, something that we would all benefit from. Part of what we're trying to do too is like, none of us can see the future, but this code will live on. And so if we set up something as a benefit now and it evens itself out, where do we go with that?
And I just wanted to interject that since it was brought up once that the steering committee, I think we need to keep our eyes on that issue as we go along so we can come up with
So we make sure.
a non-exclusive list of what our current values are for community benefits. And then it can adapt as we go, but we need something better than what we have now.
Let's go forward. We will come back to the mixed use question. Okay, so in our commercial goals are pretty specific. So require compatible transitions from commercial development to other land uses. And so this table comes out of Plan 2040, and it tells us the various commercial types, the plan level required, appropriate site location, typical site size, the locational criteria, and the maximum retail square footage, probably which was driven by some of the CC districts. So we have some very specific instructions to work from the plan, and we have gotten still not a ton of feedback on the commercial. You guys have given us the most robust conversation on commercial as part of mixed use right here. The other piece I would throw in to the conversation is brick and mortar commercial feels uncertain right now. At least in planning world, we're all having these conversations about, we don't know post-COVID what's going to be. Could just go back to where it was. Shopping as our national pastime could become something different because most of us, many of us, switched to online shopping. And what does that mean? In terms of retail, there are obviously other commercial goods that I'm not covering here. So I think we just wanted to kind of anchor everybody in this piece of information. And we may be coming back to it, particularly in design standards, because as we're talking about commercial site design, commercial location, commercial access, that's where a lot of this is going to pick up. Anybody look through this in the plan and think I have great ideas for how this needs to go in the code? Or is this something that we're going to need to refer back to a few times so we all get the hang of what it's supposed to be doing?
Tell me more about commercial strip, because I know that there were some things in our code that were trying to avoid commercial strips.
Yeah, I think that's the district that had the very specific instructions about you could only square off.
Mm-hmm.
Which was the first time I had seen that. I thought that was interesting in an interesting way. And so we want to look at commercial strip a few different ways. If we, Drew, could you go back one? Thank you. Retention and redevelopment. So some of the older strips, probably you're seeing them go from A space to B space to C space to whatever. If you want to open your D&D store and play games in here all day, that's totally fine with us. And so what we're seeing in some other communities is a look at that space to say, could we make it residential? Is there an opportunity for a tear down and redevelopment here? What we're seeing in some communities is a recognition that it can be part of mixed use. So we can take away some of the dividing lines between here's the residential and here's the commercial, and they can mix more. A little challenging if you don't do some upgrades and changes to the commercial center, to the strip center. But, I would hazard a guess that commercial strip in that form isn't the design that's going to be desired, at least in the near future. So I think just switching up that district and moving away from how hard it is to do anything or redo anything in it, and looking at it in its context, which is kind of a more site by site thing, to say, you know, you can have some horizontal mixed use here, and here's how we can see some of that happen, might encourage some redevelopment. Right now, I would imagine it's pretty locked down. It's hard to redevelop if you can only do just a little bit here and there. What I understand from talking with some of our conversations with staff is some of them have just become nice parking lots with some structure around it. So that's kind of my thought, but what do you guys think about what's on site and what's your specific thought there?
Well, my concern was, we've gotten ourselves in trouble several times when we've done zoning before plating. And so 23rd Street is a great example because it was a lot of residential lots. And they decided, the traffic is increasing on 23rd Street. We should make this commercial. And they zoned it commercial, but everybody had their own access point. And then all of a sudden your lot was worth something. So the same thing happened in the Oriad neighborhood when they said, let's do this residential dormitory, but they didn't plat a lot large enough for a dormitory. So everybody got an increase in the density. So I don't know how you ever back out of that, but I think understanding how you got into it helps us. So when I was thinking of commercial strip, I think of 23rd Street more than like the malls or something like that. I think it's going to be easier to develop Haskell and 19th in the malls than it is to say, what do we ever do with 23rd Street and
I see some
Bulldoze.
really great images. And maybe Brady, this is something that we'll put in the image book. It's commercial strips converted to partial housing, partial commercial. And so there's one from California that has a taco place in it, which we think there should be more taco places in Lawrence. So, but they popped up a second story on part of it, left commercial on part of it, and we're able to redo the site. That goes back to the conversation that we've been having with our groups though about what's it going to take to get some redevelopment going. So let's come up with some things that could happen and then make sure we can regulate to that point. And I was thinking 23rd Street also. So I think that's part of what we've all been talking about.
And also I'd add just because I know it's coming next is parking requirements.
Parking requirement.
And we have some really spots with really big parking lots that we should be encouraging that they redevelop the parking lots.
So
Mixed use work.
well, and we do parking in the next level. But just as a preview and part of the teaser that we'll probably put out in the community, we're going to recommend reduced parking requirements. We want to have a conversation about eliminating more parking requirements and letting developers say this is what we think we need. And there's maybe a conversation about parking maximums for big boxes, so they don't have Christmas Eve parking. They only need Flag Day parking. Big one. I don't know how many people shop Flag Day, but that'll be part of where we go and engage the community in that next step of the drafting. Let's go ahead. One more. So industrial, we have our industrial meeting tomorrow morning, and we're hoping to get some feedback. And so we know that Lawrence has some industrial going and is of a mindset that it's important to the community and you want to do that. And the plan speaks to the different intensity of industrial development. And so you can see, unlike some of the other categories, industrial is a city and a county thing. And so we've, gone in and looked at the city districts that will be carried forward. So this kind of medium heavy range. We pointed out last time, I think that we're recommending retiring the IDP. And just for everyone who might listen to this later and for the group, all that means is that everything that's industrial business park gets to stay, it's conforming, nobody loses any rights, but you can't rezone another property to it. So it goes off the books at some point in time. because there are a mix of uses in there that might be better handled through different districts. And so then property owners can rezone if they want to, or the city can go in and proactively rezone if that will encourage the development the city wants to see. So we don't have a lot of feedback about this particular category and don't have a ton of change in this particular category. So does anyone want to speak to industrial, or should we go ahead and keep going?
I would only say that I think there's, I mean, the uses of industrial, you know, we have to make sure we're keeping up on the times, I guess, on that. I mean, you know, I mean, we think a lot of the industrial stuff, you know, is really just an office building with maybe making something, but not the same industrial like.
Because they're in back of the office, they're possibly doing something maybe inside, maybe nobody even knows or cares what they're up to, as long as it's roughly legal.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, when we talk about, you know, commercial office, you know, if someone wants to come in and bring in, you know, 40 engineers to design stuff, and then they have 3 people in the back building something or testing something, and we say, well, that's an industrial use, you have to go there. We want to make sure we're
Like
understanding the impacts,
Flexible.
understanding the impacts and making sure we're not forcing too much into industrial and maybe defining it more by impacts than we do by output.
Right, yep, by those older classification lists.
How do you do that over time though, Brad?
What?
If ownership of that structure changes and the zoning remains, how do you reevaluate the impact of what moves in?
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's that you leave the industrial to the impact side of it, but if someone, like I said, wants 40 engineers and 3 people making something, that if you can somehow define, you know, less than 10% of or whatever, or no noise or no whatever, you know, define it by the impact. So I've seen in some other places.
I like that idea.
Yeah.
It's the next owner. What happens when they still have the same zoning?
Well, yeah, but as I'm saying, what I'm saying is the reverse, which is that would be zone commercial office. This is an office zoning, but we allow inside office
Okay.
a larger thing. Right now, sometimes our code says, well, if you're gonna make anything, you have to be in industrial.
Right. At
And so
least
then you,
industrial.
so I'm saying the reverse. Let's make sure our office is big enough, while commercial is broad enough that we could put some light impact in there. I agree with you.
So we're,
What's industrial has to be industrial.
okay, so basically what we're doing is we're limiting the use by our kind of expanded use zoning. So it can't turn into a heavier use.
Yeah.
It would have to drop back into
Exactly.
commercial.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's an accessory use. You would say,
Yeah.
you would say you can have 10% of your area an accessory use.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Anybody else? What if somebody wants to do some manufacturing in the backyard of their residential district?
So Class B home occupations that happen to be, I think there's cottage industries is what is listed as here. I thought it was interesting that those were only allowed in very sparse residential districts and not anywhere else, especially because the definition specifically mentions stuff like candle making. Like, there's no way that has got to be a disruptive thing in an apartment building, right? Like, do we really need to limit it to just the farm country? So
Right now it needs light industrial.
tallow candles. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
So, and same question, just about home occupations in general. We want to be fairly permissive with home occupations. I think maybe we learned during COVID that it's not that bad to have almost everybody at home.
I had a question about home occupations in general, and this is on the module online, but I figured I'd bring it up for everybody. Is there a national definition of Class A or Type A and Type B, or is that just something that we call it here?
It's a Lawrence thing.
Okay, so if so,
Communities that do something very similar, but
yeah.
those are usually homegrown regulations.
So if that's the case, Type A, like if you'll read the definition, it's literally just like what people normally do. Like, I'm gonna work out of my home. I'm gonna sell things online out of my home. It's weird that we even define that. It's just, it is what it is, right? So it seems like we could probably just call it home occupations and regulate the stuff that actually is a little bit more interesting than just selling Legos out of your basement. And I think after I read through it, I realized, there are some actually pretty sweet permissions here that are more progressive and kind of take the learnings from COVID into account. But there are other ones that are kind of odd, like no outdoor anything at all ever. Like, did we forget the first 5 months of COVID entirely? Like everything had to be outdoor, right? Seems like we should maybe allow that a little bit. Or things like context insensitive visiting hours. It's very different if you have a quiet cul-de-sac in an R1 and people visiting at all hours of the day. That's kind of rude. But if you're in a fairly vibrant apartment complex or in a much more dense part of the city, who's even going to notice, right? So I think there was a lot of ones that are very detailed. What do you say?
You'll start to say too many people going in and out of that apartment quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some guy wrote in the Florence Times today about, what's the difference between fixing your car in your driveway and, paying someone to drive a car,
Or fixing your lawnmower in your garage versus paying somebody, like, should be the same, you'd think, right?
Yeah. That's a good time.
I don't know who that would have been.
One would happen a lot more times. And so that's, like you can have a garage sale, but if you have a garage sale at your house every Friday, Saturday and Sunday, then all of a sudden that does impact the neighborhood differently than if you're having your garage sale twice a year.
And I think the frequency can be context sensitive too. So.
Okay, let's move on. We have a few more things we have to cover, so let's go next slide. We kind of talked about everything. Let's do next slide. So these were some of the questions from our last meeting that we just wanted to circle back on. So we went ahead and did show in the new draft ADUs in I think all districts except the R5 by right. And my thinking on that was R5 could be high density, but should be high density, but it didn't occur to me that someone might do townhomes in an R5 and those could have an ADU. So we'll go back and make that edit. I think we talked this one through today, so we're good. In terms of the use table, so we find that communities either love looking at the use table and moving everything around, making it perfect, or they do not want to look at it. It is not your job as the steering committee to line edit the use table. However, if you glance over it and notice that you'd like to see uses changed, we'd love to hear about that. Or, allowed in more places, allowed in fewer places. I think I want to clarify there, even though we're not asking you to line edit the code, we are definitely looking for detailed conversations when you're ready to have them. So in the same way that we talked about the dimensions, we haven't talked as much about what's going on in the use table. So please feel free to take a look at it. You can comment on the online one, or you can just pull together comments and send them to Jeff or Becky and they'll get forwarded. We're going to have a conversation about gas stations. This is kind of a development, sustainability, change question, and we thought we'd explore it with you. We, as a nation these days, we're pretty generous with where we allow gas stations, and we have all our major car manufacturers moving towards something electric, and so it could be, despite Brody explaining to me that electric cars are very heavy and they will be taking up, making a lot of damage in the roads. That's a different problem. What do we think will happen to gas stations as we switch to electric vehicles? And is this kind of a category that we want to think about going forward? What could happen? Many of them have really primo locations. Right? They like to be on that corner of the interchange. They've got good access. I don't know that it's likely that they'll just pull out the gas tanks and switch to electric, because we'll be doing some of that at home and some of it at work. So just as a future thinking sort of exercise, I wanted to see, what will happen to gas stations over the next 20 years? And what do you think? How many quaint cafes can we put into gas stations after they go? Recognizing And that's possibly an equity question because not everybody will move to an electric car. They are currently expensive. They will continue to be expensive. For people for whom buying a new car is out of reach, driving a gas car will probably be the thing they do for some time. So change and something that will still be necessary. What do you think?
I'll start out because I am delighted to have an electric car.
Yeah.
But that's because I have a garage and I can use, do it overnight at home. So the other big question about electric cars is how do people who live in an apartment building or live in a older rental property have any access to that? It's not going to be gas stations because nobody's going to want to go and plug in and wait for, the 2 or 3, takes 30 minutes, even if it's fast, so I think we are going to continue to have gas stations. I think we're not going to have a lot more being built. Right?
Yeah, unless they're big ones like Casey's or.
I think Casey's is like maxed out.
Yeah, but we're not gonna get,
Cases will just convert to like pizza sales.
but I don't think neighborhood gas stations are gone. I mean, Lawrence has had too many problems with those as it is. One on 6th Street, there's still a monitoring well from years ago in place, even though now it's turned into a restaurant. Another one at 19th and Mass is site planning for another drive-through coffee shop. How many of those are we gonna get? But those things are dangerous to have in neighborhoods. Yeah, but so we see most of them along where they are now. I don't think we're gonna see them expand much unless it's out in a big vacant field at the moment that's gonna build around it. But we aren't building them next to houses so much, except for on 6th Street with Casey's, which replaced a gas station or used car lot. I can't remember which. But that's zoned for that right now. But I think they're just a menace.
They're an incubator for new restaurants.
Or pawn shops.
Yes.
Drive-through restaurants.
I'm going to say KDHE is, I think, trying to do a good job of monitoring what's happening. We have much better regulations on the tanks.
Yeah.
So.
Just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah.
One, I don't think the conversation should be limited to cars, but also include bikes.
Yep.
Electric bikes, which have a similar need
Yeah.
in terms of access to energy,
Yep.
are increasing as you travel around to larger cities, particularly overseas. Electric bikes and even things like scooters are everywhere and growing fast and terribly dangerous, but another subject. I think to me that makes me think about not so much the specifics of a gas station, but how do we need to be thinking about broad access to power, broad access to that capability for anyone, including that where it might be an equity issue, where they might not, their access, their needs might be a little bit different than mainstream. And how do we accommodate that? How do we provide for the community? Not just at a location. And then lastly, specific to gas stations, my sense is that from a technology perspective, the need to get at a rapid charge sufficient to let you get from where you're going, it's going to be the same as the need to get at gas. And that technology will continue to evolve, and some central place where that happens. And maybe it happens, all at the same place, both whatever your electric needs are and whatever your fossil fuel needs are, could come in that same place. I guess what I'm saying is I don't see that going away anytime soon. I think it changes.
Okay. So maybe reducing the gas footprint portion of it, but filling that out with fast charging.
And providing a path by thinking about it in advance to enable it, not just to allow it, but to enable it, maybe even encourage it, could be a benefit to the whole community as well.
Well, does anyone in our group know? So in Colorado, we just did a funky thing. We passed emergency changes to the energy code that are going to require automobile EV charging stations to go in as each community updates their building code. But I was under the impression that the next round of building code, so 2025, 2028, 2024 has some basic EV requirements in it, and I could understand that incorrectly.
I have not seen the 24 code yet. I don't think it's been fully released. I don't know if that's in there yet or
Okay.
not.
Because I would think some of this will evolve through building code or energy code since it is electricity. But what we want to think of in terms of is space and location, right? So if I'm, driving through and didn't get to charge my car last night, like a husband I might be married to who forgets to charge his phone overnight and has to plug it in his car might need that. Maybe not though, because, we're also seeing, shopping malls putting them in or grocery stores putting them in. So we'll see where that goes.
But the bigger picture right now is bicycles. Here now, bicycles can be a bigger issue, and we could go ahead and put infrastructure to secure bikes, to secure e-bikes, to secure to make bicycles more prevalent and relevant into the development of these.
So when we do
areas.
the infrastructure for e-bikes, and I have to confess, I've been more immersed in the cars than the e-bikes, but I won't make myself more knowledgeable. Is it something that the city would provide as part of,
Thinking.
where would we do that? I guess my first question is where? Who and where would like EV charging go?
From what I've seen, you can just plug them in
Just
a
a regular
regular outlet.
So it could be just as simple as a bollard with some outlets in it that you can secure the bikes. to.
And that could charge your cell phone and your bike or whatever else.
Okay, and we have heard that upping the bicycling infrastructure in Lawrence will help with the bicycling, commuting and transportation in Lawrence, that it's the infrastructure just in terms of parking or charging is iffy. And it's hard to predictably go from place to place and know that you can store your bike or charge your bike. So that has come up across multiple conversations over the last couple of days.
I think I also mentioned this morning that one of our employees rode a Segway to work, and ever since he started, he's been doing that. And I saw a gal in my neighborhood on a Segway passing out flyers. I'm like, what's the deal with the Segway?
They're reselling them from like Las Vegas tours. Okay, so we've got kind of a future thinking conversation. Let's do next slide. So let's just do some basics here. When you reviewed module 1, did you find it readable? Were you able to make sense of it? Were there any notes that you scribbled to yourself, like, see if they just turned this like 8 pages of text into one table, this would be better, or need an image here. And you don't have to tell me anything off the top of your head. I realize I'm putting everyone on the spot, but that's all feedback we'd like to have. One of the things we're getting at is a user-friendly code.
I thought it was fairly easy and readable, but I also feel like this might be a relatively self-selected group of people who are interested in zoning and already kind of are familiar with it. There's maybe a couple of us who are new to it, but I guess I'm more curious from your perspective, how have people who just kind of come into the various events talked about it? Have they expressed confusion to how it's organized or general understanding?
I don't think we have a few people who clearly read it and have specific thoughts about it. We have a lot more listening and idea sharing going on right now, and questions about what's going to happen if this thing takes place. So I think that once we finish getting comments within the code itself, that will tell us what the clarity level was, because people will flag stuff that doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
And we'll know to clean that up.
Okay.
But we just wanted to make sure that as a group, this is going to be one of our questions for you every single time. And because if it doesn't make sense to you as code nerds, it is definitely not going to make sense to other people. And you have to go very far to hurt our feelings on something like that. If it doesn't work, even if it's worked in other communities, if it doesn't work here, it doesn't work here, right? And we're drafting a code for Lawrence, so we're open to the comments.
I think it was just an overload for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I mean, because of 230 pages. So they just said, I know I'm supposed to go look at this, but I don't even know where to start. So I think with module 2, it might be good to have the module and say, these are 10 things that we want you to think about, and you can find them on pages,
Okay,
you know,
okay.
232, so that they can say, oh, I'm interested in this. This is where I'm gonna go. And I'm gonna go back really quickly to the ADUs, because I think you can say, are ADUs allowed everywhere? And then we should ask other questions like, how would you feel if it had to be owner occupied? Can it be developed anywhere? Is there a reason to have both? You know, so if you're in an area where everything's rental, it just feels like, oh, people are gonna just try to get, you know, more units on their lot. If it's, and you're not gonna have anybody who's got their mother-in-law coming to stay.
Right.
So just expanding a little bit those questions.
Okay, leaving it less open-ended, and saying read it, good luck, but instead of saying, okay, we want to direct you to some of this, and if you come up with other stuff, let us know what you.
Right, right.
I might be saying similar things, but you know, that I thought it was well done, clear, easy to read. But if you don't bring your own ideas, your own context to it, it's just tougher to understand what it's saying. So having context and scenarios is what makes that come alive for people. Hard to do that much.
Yeah.
That's from someone at, 232 pages is only planning commission.
Right.
Easy read.
Next.
Okay, okay. One of the things that we can do with module 2 then is give the instructions, and then as we go to the public, we can share that same set of instructions with them. And say, this is what we're reading from what we're looking at. That's helpful. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so there's more, just in case it wasn't enough. So we've got more meetings tomorrow. And then we've got 2 virtual meetings. So if you bump into anybody that wasn't able to make it to one of the live meetings and wanted to talk about it, we're going to do, I believe, a morning meeting on the 28th and an afternoon meeting on the 31st. So that's a Friday and a Monday. And we'll just kind of do open mic. So whoever wants to drop in and talk about anything, those times are available also. We're going to update the planning commission on the 26th. So meeting in a box is almost rewritten and is going to become less about character areas and more about explore your neighborhood. We talked about this a little bit. The holdup is entirely me at this point in time. So I have already nominated Brody as my accountability buddy for a variety of things. So this is going on the list. So we will get that out for the conversation about what goes on in the neighborhoods. For next steps, before we moved on to module 2, we wanted to make sure that the group was comfortable, that we've had the conversations we want to have about module 1. And we didn't know if you'd want to do an August meeting on module 1, or if you want to hold up. And then as soon as we have completed staff draft review of module 2, we'll move into that. Right? I think, Brad, I would go with whatever the group's pleasure is. We would do another meeting virtually, but we can all still get together if you guys want to talk about it more.
Well, I've obviously what the group wants. I've heard a lot of people say kind of like some others, which is I kind of get module 1, but until I see module 2, I don't have, I'm okay with they want to see what the parking requirements are and what the designs are and all that before they feel if they're real comfortable talking more about module 1. So I would kind of say, I think we build on ourselves. So let's talk about module 2. But while we're talking about module 2, we're going to be referring back to module 1. I might have more comments on it as we contextualize it with module 2. But I'm okay with having another meeting on module 1 if others think they need that at the moment.
I think I've heard the same thing that you have, that let's build on it and it's really, the density and what are the parking standards going to be and what do these things look like before we just say, oh, that's.
I agree, more details so we can have better conversation about what we did today.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, so we will get it to staff, get it cleaned up and get it out, and it's late July, so I think we'd look for maybe an early mid-September meeting to do module 2 and then do the 2 together absolutely correctly, because the more you know, the more you want to backtrack and say, yeah, now I understand what's going to happen with this.
I would certainly encourage the committee members, again, because we're all a little more into this, to go onto the online code and put your notes in there. Be it, let's get those out there and get, those specific ones. We've been talking big picture, but if, on uses and other things, get in there and make your comments. I think that would be useful.
You want in the weeds kind of comments?
I think they're ready for, yeah.
You can disagree with our use of adverbs or adjectives, or not like the fact that you can't comment on the numbering system. We inherited that. That's change. So, yeah.
So I think you mentioned at a previous meeting, and maybe in the one yesterday, that when it comes to comments that are kind of cut and dry, like I think we should do this, then I think you were saying if there isn't any obvious objection, like, okay, we'll just change it for the next one. But I suspect there's going to be a couple of comments. I know at least a couple of mine are probably kind of more controversial that aren't as cut and dry. I say like, yeah, I'll follow up on that. Sure. For ones where there may need to be a discussion before we decide on something, what is the appropriate venue to do that? Like, just as an example, I think the dimensional standards could maybe be changed a little bit or relaxed a little bit to more fit in with Plan 2040. But I mean, I commented on that on the draft, but you guys aren't the be all end all in deciding exactly what this is, because you wouldn't want the blowback when somebody says like, wait, why did you decide that? Oh, because Nick Kuzmiak said it was a cool idea. Like, why would you listen to him? So, yeah. All this guy complain.
I think you're on track. That is the kind of thing that we would bring back to the group. And so we will summarize the comments. We were talking to Jeff and Becky today about how they handled the comments on Plan 2040, because we thought taking a similar approach would be something the community might expect to see.
Yeah.
So we will pull and read all the comments, and we will only pick up those comments that are so simple, like you double type the here.
Yeah.
We really don't want to own this. We want to be able to do what the community wants to see.
Mm-hmm.
So if it is in alignment with Plan 2040 or the downtown plan or some other plan, but it's a big change, we're going to bring it back to you guys. And so that will be part of our next discussion. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. If it is lost in space somewhere, or just an excellent idea that is in the wrong time or in the wrong location, we'll probably still bring it forward. And, with our thoughts that this isn't, implementing the plan or any of the instructions we have, but, in many ideas that seem just kind of out there to start with, there's a seed of something useful in there. So we want to make sure that you're able to have a discussion about it. Someone with a different perspective than the group members might bring a really good idea to us. So on the whole, there will be a bucket of comments for us to work through on module 1. We can probably get module 2 going and out to the public, and then back up and deal with module 1 comments while we're leaving module 2 out to the public.
Yeah.
And so kind of do that timing on all 3 modules.
Sounds like a really good plan.
What is the projected release date for module 2 beyond the staff release date for, when you say public, do you mean the steering committee?
Steering committee first.
Okay.
And we will do it the same way we did module 1. So steering committee gets it first, gives us some basic guidance and instructions for things that need to go forward or further or be pulled back. We do some quick revisions and then it goes to the public. Took us about a week and a half to turn it around after the last meeting, 2 weeks. So let's say, we get it realistically to, planning staff, next week. Give them a moment to get through the couple hundred pages, that it's gonna take them to do that. So 3 weeks for turnaround on that. We're in mid-August at that point. We need probably a week or two to go back through to do cleanups, to talk to staff one more time about what they're doing. So that's how we get to an early September meeting for this group on module 2. Then you give us your changes, one more cleanup, so public sees it mid-September.
Okay.
Would be about when that would go out. Sound realistic? Gets us through those last minute August vacations, and we can come in and sit down and do some more work. And I want to thank everyone for being here again, just a few weeks later after our last meeting. Got anything else? Okay, this is what we've been up to. We have a drop-in meeting after our meeting tonight. And so for the drop-ins, we haven't given anyone a specific topic. They can come in and ask about anything. I think that we have one or two drop-ins this afternoon, 2 drop-ins this afternoon. And so on the whole, the amount of information that as your consultants were walking away with is fantastic. And helps us move this forward. So we'll finish out tomorrow with a roundtable on industrial and special districts, and then our brown bag lunch on equity. Our equity discussion to date has not been as robust as our housing and sustainability discussion. So we're going to dig a little deeper and see who else we can get in touch with and who else we want to talk to get that part of the conversation going. If you guys have suggestions for that and could share with Jeff and Becky for outreach, we'd love that. And then the 2 virtual meetings. So those will be, they'll be on the city Zoom. These Zoom city teams, city Zoom. We'll have that posted on the website. It may be on there now. Yes. Questions about any of this? No? Okay. Next slide. Thank you. Thank you. Really, really. We asked you to rehash module 1 and pick up some of these pieces tonight. And our conversation is getting deeper each time. And so we benefit from you guys being willing to sit here and talk about things that are part of your lives. So thank you. So, okay, we'll go through all the crafting promise because otherwise we're getting down same on me. And we'll get some educational stuff started and perhaps bounce that off of everybody by emails over the next few weeks, see what you think about it and go from there.
There's something, can I say something?
You want to say something?
So, next time.
I guess like with the module 1, and I obviously don't have a clue other than just coming into meetings, but when we were talking about light industrial and allowing certain things going on, I think that's probably where the public's gonna look at the ADU part, where we're human. We're driving our own selves to extinction, noise pollution, light pollution, quality of life issues, people working from home, what the noise, light issues will be. I mean, there's ordinances in place for noise, but the police aren't going to be able to come and handle all of that. So I think it's just boiled down to a quality of life and what people want around them. And not everyone is going to be a homeowner, not because, it's out of reach financially, but it's just, they're not going to be. So it's just a fine balance. And I just think pollution on all levels need to be taken into consideration. And I don't think it has anything to do with people don't want change. I think we're just looking forward and ahead of what is our quality of life going to look like down the line when everything's gone. And you can always put in concrete.
Right.
So.
Yeah, no, I want to say thanks for being here and being willing to speak in the room full of experts. Thank you. I think we actually touched on a few things tonight that got wrapped up into your comments, and we love hearing from you because this is part of what, how do we get other people to come talk about this? So thank you. And that's really good.
Okay, thank you all.
I just want to follow up on what Mr. Kuzmiak brought up earlier about Strong Town. And that as you said, we can't run particular specific numbers on any given project. But if Strong Towns has come up with general overall cost benefit analysis from other statistical examples, it seems important that to me is kind of a pivotal question for this whole process. That the way the code is currently drafted, just like the smart code, density is optional. A developer doesn't have to choose to do that. I mean, the way that the zones currently are drawn up, not all of it requires density or mixed use. So it seems to me that going forward, if we want to achieve density, like as Kay pointed out, it's going to, first of all, it's going to have to be profitable for the developer. If it's profitable, more so than not doing density, they will choose to do it to make more money. I mean, this is a market economy. And yeah, I mean, bringing something in as mixed use, kind of like Phil pointed out, sends that signal, but still it doesn't require anything. I think it's going to be important when I talk about the cost benefit, I think it's much broader. It includes the increased valuation of the land, which produces more tax revenues. The mid-month meeting last week, the consultant pointed that out. It increases the tax revenue for the city, potentially increases the return on investment for the developer. A more compact development has potentially smaller, less concrete, asphalt, less electric use for smaller pump stations, that kind of thing. A number of different factors that I don't know, and maybe it's $100 consultant who can run those numbers, but it seems important that we have a handle on those numbers. If a developer can see that there's good potential there, and I don't know if they're willing to share those numbers of what their return is, the percent, if it's 20%, like Mr. Richardson pointed out last week, or if it's more or less, I don't even know if they're willing to share that so that we can run those numbers, but it just seems important. Just for the whole question.
I think there'd be some industry information out there. Lawrence is not terribly unique from other communities out there with the same kind of question. I just wonder if maybe there's some industry info that could be had that would inform that.
I want to jump in and pump the brakes on this discussion. We, as your consultant, don't have instructions to walk this path, and it is definitely a policy choice. So if this is something the city wants to see, we probably want to pass this out to planning commission and city commission and have them give us some input on whether or not this is a place they want to go. I am a fan of Strong Towns, but they aren't giving us the entire picture here. Other types of development, the industrial development, the commercial development, have higher than 100% return on their use of infrastructure. So they, in some regards, offset the residential. It is a good conversation. What are we paying for in terms of infrastructure? How are we using it? Is critical to how a city functions and budgets, but is at the moment above our pay grade. So if this is a conversation we want to pursue, and I will look at our chairperson, then we probably want to feed it back up the pipeline and see what kind of instruction we get.
Well, we've had, we can talk more about that. We've definitely had those discussions about that, and we ran some numbers. If the new development, the new single family development by Rock Chalk, with $550,000 homes on very small lots, pencils out very well that it pays for itself. If all those were $200,000 lot $200,000 houses that would not pay for themselves. And you have a question of what's more important, having $200,000 houses that people can afford that don't pay for themselves, or $550,000 houses that pay for themselves. And those are different questions that have a lot of policy implications that you're not just answering the one question. And so I think we all agree, I think, density and developers, if they can do it in ways that they think they can sell them and they think they have the ability, like dimensional standards, setbacks, things like that, that they can get more in there and sell it. I think they go, I think it's much more natural that they will do that. And that's why that's what this code can make those changes. I mean, Phil was here last time saying he doesn't care what the density is. He wants to know when the setbacks are. That's what defines how many houses he can get. And then that defines how much money he can make. And that defines how many houses they'll build. So I agree with a lot of that. So.
But Brad, if I could add, that framework is single dwelling concept. If we have more multi-dwelling, there's more units per acre for the given infrastructure that's required.
Absolutely.
That changes the numbers there too.
And again, to allow that, I think is, because right now we tell somebody you either get to build single family or you don't get to build single family. We don't say you can build a single family with a duplex next to it, with 4 houses next to it, with a fourplex on the corner. I mean, our code doesn't allow that. I mean, that's what we need this code to allow.
Do that.
Yeah, and if that allows them to be flexible and dense, I think that is where to me, that's why I wanted to see the code go, to allow that. And allow those mixed uses and the coffee shop on the corner with 2 apartments above it, with a duplex next to it, with a single family home next to that.
ADU in the backyard.
Yeah, bicycle repair shop, there you go. So,
Okay,
okay,
okay.
we've now got to 6, so, okay. Thank you, public. That's just it.
Self-educated.
Wait a minute.
I do a little bit on the